1964 was not a good year to be a crooner. In February, four boys from Liverpool named the Beatles had landed at JFK Airport, and the world had tilted on its axis. The screams of teenage girls were drowning out the smooth, whiskey-soaked baritones of the Rat Pack era. Frank Sinatra was furious. He called rock and roll the most brutal, ugly, degenerate, vicious form of expression it has been my displeasure to hear. But Dean Martin? Dean didn't get furious. He got funny. Dean looked at these kids with their mop-top haircuts and electric guitars, and he didn't see a threat. He saw a punchline. He was Dean Martin. He had survived the Depression, the steel mills of Ohio, the mobsters of Steubenville, and Jerry Lewis. He wasn't going to be scared of a few British kids who needed a haircut and a bath. While the rest of the old guard was panicking, barricading their mansions against the changing tide, Dean Martin decided to invite the enemy into his living room. Or rather, onto his stage. The battlefield was the Hollywood Palace. It was a Saturday night variety show on ABC, broadcast from the El Capitan Theater on Vine Street. It was the epitome of old Hollywood. It had orchestras, jugglers, elephants, trapeze artists, and men in tuxedos telling polite jokes. It was safe. It was glamorous. It was everything rock and roll wanted to destroy. On June 3, 1964, Dean Martin was the host. He was in his prime. The tuxedo fit like a second skin. The cigarette smoke curled around him like a halo. He was relaxed, slightly tipsy, or pretending to be, and completely in control. But the producers had booked a guest act to boost the ratings with the younger demographic. A new band from England. They weren't the cute, lovable Beatles in their matching suits. These guys were different. They were scruffy. They looked dangerous. They played blues covers with a sneer. They were the Rolling Stones. When Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and the rest of the band arrived at the El Capitan Theater, it was like aliens landing on a hostile planet. They were terrified. They were barely 20 years old. They had never been on American television before. To them, Dean Martin was a dinosaur, a relic of their parents' generation. But he was also a giant. Dean walked into the rehearsal. He saw them. Keith Richards was wearing denim. Brian Jones looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Mick Jagger was practicing his chicken strut dance moves. Dean watched them for a moment, took a drag of his cigarette, and turned to his producer, Nick Vanoff. "Are these the Animal Act?" Dean asked, deadpan. Or did the garbage men forget to pick up the trash? He wasn't whispering. The Stones heard him. They glared. Dean just winked. He wasn't being malicious, he was just being Dean. In his world, if you didn't wear a tie, you were half-dressed. If you didn't comb your hair, you were a bum. He didn't understand that this bum look was a fashion statement. He just thought they were poor. The tension backstage was palpable. The Rolling Stones were nervous. They knew they were walking into the lion's den. This wasn't a rock concert, this was a variety show for middle-aged Americans sitting on their couches in Kansas. Dean refused to learn their names. To him, they were just the boys, or the things. He saw Mick Jagger doing vocal warm-ups in the corner, strange yelps and screams. Dean mimicked him to a stagehand, making a face like he had stepped in something wet. "I think he's in pain," Dean quipped. "Someone get him an aspirin. Or a muzzle." The Stones tried to act tough. They smoked cigarettes, huddled together, trying to project that "too cool to care" attitude. But they were shaking. They knew who Dean Martin was. They knew he had the microphone. And in show business, the man with the microphone holds the gun. The cameras rolled. The orchestra struck up Dean's theme song. The audience applauded politely. Dean slid onto the stage, drink in hand, looking like he had just rolled out of bed in a tuxedo. He did his monologue. He sang a few songs. He was charming, effortless, the king of cool. The audience ate it up. They felt safe with Dean. He was the barrier against the chaos of the 1960s. Then, it was time to introduce the guest act. Dean stood center stage. He looked at the camera with a weary expression, like a father forced to watch his daughter's terrible school play. And now, Dean said, swirling the ice in his glass, something for the youngsters. He paused for effect. 5 singing boys from England who sold a lot of albums. He looked at the cue card, then back at the camera. They're called the Rolling Stones. I've been Rolling Stones for 20 years, and I haven't sold a nickel. The audience laughed. It was a gentle jab. But Dean was just warming up. The curtain opened. The Rolling Stones launched into Not Fade Away. It was raw. It was loud. It was muddy. Mick Jagger shook his maracas, pouting his lips, shaking his hips in a way that defied the laws of physics and decency of 1964. Keith Richards hammered his guitar. To the kids watching at home, it was revolution. To the audience in the theater, it was noise. To Dean Martin, standing in the wings, it was a comedy sketch. He watched Mick Jagger's strut. He watched the hair flopping in their eyes. He turned to the stage manager. "They're gonna need a lot of shampoo after this," he muttered. The song ended. The applause was mixed, screams from a few planted teenagers, polite confusion from the adults. Usually, the host brings the act over, shakes their hands, says, "Great job, boys." Dean didn't do that. The Stones retreated into the shadows, and Dean walked back to the center spot. He looked traumatized. He looked up at the ceiling as if asking God for patience. This is the moment that went down in history. Dean didn't just move on to the next segment. He decided to use the Stones as a prop for his comedy. He looked at the camera. "That was the Rolling Stones," he said. "Aren't they great?" The sarcasm dripped off the word great like grease. Then, he went for the kill. "I read in the paper that these boys are going to London to get their hair cut." Pause. "But that's not true." Pause. "They're going to London to get their tires changed." The audience roared. It was a dad joke, but delivered with Dean's lethal timing, it was devastating. He was mocking their appearance, their hygiene, their very existence. But he wasn't done. Later in the show, there was a trampoline act. A man was bouncing high into the air. Dean stood by the trampoline, watching him. "That's the father of the Rolling Stones," Dean quipped. "He's been trying to kill himself ever since he saw them." It was brutal. It was relentless. Dean Martin was systematically dismantling the credibility of the biggest new band in the world, treating them like a circus sideshow. Backstage, Mick Jagger was fuming. He was young, but he had an ego. He knew he was being mocked. He wanted to say something. He wanted to confront Dean. "He's an old man," Keith Richards reportedly grumbled. "Forget him. He doesn't get it." But they couldn't forget him. Because Dean Martin wasn't just some old man, he was the coolest man on earth, and he had just declared that they were uncool. It stung. Dean, meanwhile, was oblivious to their anger. He walked past their dressing room on his way out. He saw them sitting there, sullen and angry. Dean stopped. He leaned into the doorway. "Don't worry, boys," he said, flashing that $1,000,000 smile. "You'll be famous for about 10 minutes. Enjoy it." He truly believed it. He thought rock and roll was a fad. He thought these long-haired kids were a seasonal allergy that would clear up by winter. He had no idea that he had just insulted a band that would fill stadiums for the next 60 years. That broadcast of the Hollywood Palace became a symbol. It was the visual representation of the generation gap. On one side, Dean Martin. Tuxedo, alcohol, Frank Sinatra, Vegas, the 1950s. On the other side, the Rolling Stones. Denim, drugs, rebellion, London, the 1960s. Dean thought he had won the battle. He got the laughs. He owned the stage. But he didn't realize he was losing the war. The kids watching at home didn't laugh at Dean's jokes, they hated him for them. They saw an arrogant adult making fun of their heroes. In that moment, Dean Martin solidified his status as the establishment. But there is a twist. Years later, Keith Richards would admit something surprising. He said that despite the insults, despite the tires changed joke, watching Dean Martin work was a masterclass. He didn't give a damn, Richards said. And that was the most rock and roll thing I'd ever seen. Dean Martin went home that night in 1964 thinking he had put the animals in their place. He poured a drink, watched a western, and slept the sleep of the righteous. But the universe has a wicked sense of irony. A year later, the noise wasn't just on television, it was coming from his own garage in Beverly Hills. Dean's son, Dino Paul Martin, Dino Jr., was a teenager. He worshipped the very people his father mocked. He didn't want to wear a tuxedo, he wanted to wear Beatle boots. He didn't want to sing, that's amore, he wanted to play electric guitar. Dino Jr. formed a band called Dino, Desi and Billy, with Desi Arnaz Jr. and Billy Hinch. They were a pop-rock band. They had long hair, by Dean's standards. They played loud. One afternoon, Dean walked into the garage. He was holding a golf club. He saw his son and his friends making a racket that shook the walls. He looked at Dino Jr., who was trying to look like a mini Mick Jagger. Dean didn't scream. He didn't forbid it. He just looked at them with profound confusion. Why do you have to scream? Dean asked, genuinely puzzled. The microphone is right there. It amplifies the voice. You don't have to yell. Dino Jr. rolled his eyes. It's rock and roll, Dad. You don't get it. I get it, Dean muttered, walking away. I get that I need better insulation. But here is the twist, Dean supported them. He hated the music, but he loved his son. He used his connections to get them signed to Reprise Records, Frank Sinatra's label. He let them perform on the Dean Martin Show. He would introduce them, roll his eyes at the camera, put in earplugs as a joke, and then stand on the side and watch his son with quiet pride. He was a dinosaur allowing the mammals to take over his territory, simply because one of them was his blood. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the 10 minutes of fame Dean predicted for the Rolling Stones stretched into a decade. They didn't fade away. They became gods. They filled stadiums. They became the symbol of excess, rebellion, and power. Dean Martin, meanwhile, watched his world shrink. The nightclubs were closing. The variety shows were being cancelled. The tuxedo era was ending, replaced by the era of tie-dye, denim, and disco. But Dean did something remarkable. He didn't change. Other singers from his generation tried to adapt. Frank Sinatra recorded pop songs and wore Nehru jackets, a disaster. Bing Crosby tried to act hip. Dean Martin refused. He kept the tuxedo. He kept the cigarette. He kept the old songs. He looked at the changing world and decided that if the world wanted to go crazy, that was fine, but he was staying at the bar. And strangely, this made him cool again. While the Rolling Stones were chasing trends, getting arrested, and creating chaos, Dean Martin became a monolith of stability. The rockers started to respect him. Not for his music, but for his attitude. Keith Richards, the ultimate rebel, admired Dean's commitment to not giving a damn. Dean was punk before punk existed because he truly, deeply did not care what anyone thought of him. Decades passed. The clip of Dean roasting the Stones on the Hollywood Palace became a cult classic. It was traded on VHS tapes, then uploaded to YouTube. It became the definitive document of the culture war. Journalists would ask Mick Jagger about it. "Do you remember Dean Martin?" Mick, now a knight of the realm, a millionaire many times over, would smile that jagged smile. "Oh, I remember," Mick said in an interview. "He was quite rude, wasn't he? He was trying to be funny at our expense. The old guard protecting their turf." But there was no anger in Mick's voice anymore. Just amusement. Mick realized that Dean wasn't attacking them personally, he was attacking what they represented. Dean was the last Roman emperor laughing at the barbarians at the gate, not realizing the barbarians were about to burn the city down. Mick also admitted something else. He had great timing, Mick said. Even when he was insulting us, you had to admire the delivery. The man knew how to work a room. Remember Dean's joke about the trampoline artist? That's the Rolling Stones' father. He's been trying to kill himself ever since he saw them. The irony is that the Rolling Stones survived everything. Drugs, arrests, feuds, death. They are still touring in their 80s. They proved Dean wrong in the most spectacular way possible. They didn't just have 10 minutes, they had 60 years. But Dean was right about one thing, the tires. In their later years, the Rolling Stones did become a machine, a corporation, a brand. They became efficient. They became the establishment. And Dean? Dean faded into the silence he always craved. When he died in 1995, the lights of Las Vegas were dimmed. But the most telling tribute came from the rock world. On the night Dean died, during a concert, a rock band, not the Stones, but of that generation, stopped their show. The lead singer, a man with long hair and tattoos, took the microphone. "To the king of cool," he said. "He hated us. But we loved him." And they played a slow, distorted version of "Everybody Loves Somebody." Imagine if they met today. Mick Jagger, 80 years old, still sprinting across the stage. Dean Martin, if he were alive, 107 years old, sitting on a stool. Mick would probably still be trying to prove something, trying to show he's still got the energy. Dean would just look at him, take a sip of apple juice, and say, "Sit down, kid. You're gonna hurt yourself. You're still rolling, but the moss is catching up." That 1964 broadcast remains a masterpiece because it captured a moment that can never happen again, the precise second when the 20th century split in two. Dean Martin stood on one side, holding a martini. The Rolling Stones stood on the other, holding electric guitars. They looked at each other with suspicion, with disdain, and with fear. Dean won the night. But the Stones won the century. And yet, if you ask any man in a tuxedo at a wedding which version of cool he wants to be, he doesn't want to be the sweaty guy jumping around in tight pants. He wants to be the guy leaning against the piano, doing absolutely nothing, and owning the room. Dean Martin lost the battle of the charts. But he won the war of style.